I have spent nearly 2 decades inspecting subterranean structures across the Rockies. And over that time, I have developed a rhythm. My name is Thomas Kepler, and I am a structural inspection engineer specializing in hydroelectric tunnels. I've been tasked with monitoring the integrity of aging concrete and rock interfaces, ensuring that the old waterworks remain functional despite decades of wear and natural erosion. I know every damp corner, every subtle seam in the reinforced walls, every shift in the sounds that accompany pressure in the conduit. The facility I inspect sits high in the mountains, built into a watershed that once supplied several now-defunct mining operations. Its tunnels stretch for miles, some bored directly into solid granite, others lined with concrete that is cracking in slow, predictable patterns. Maintenance crews work alongside me, but my focus is always on what the structure tells me. The tension in the supports, the moisture patterns on the walls, the barely perceptible hum of water flowing under pressure. My job is not one for hurry. Each step is deliberate, each measurement precise. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, and whether you've ever heard anything like this yourself. Hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks. On the morning of my most recent inspection, the air was sharp, almost metallic. I ran through the standard checks. Water levels at intake points, the condition of expansion joints, bolt tension, and the behavior of the supporting arches. The crew and I moved deliberately, exchanging only the necessary words over the echoing hum of pumps and the muted clatter of tools. I pride myself on noticing what others miss, the subtle signs that a crack is about to extend or a support is weakening. Yet, nothing in my decades of work had prepared me for what I would begin to notice in these tunnels. Routine dominates life here. We measure pressure, record readings, calibrate instruments, and walk the length of each accessible tunnel. Every bolt, every seam, every joint is cataloged and photographed. Inspectors before me have left behind meticulous logs. Mine builds on theirs, noting incremental changes with an almost obsessive attention. It is precise, methodical work. There is a hierarchy. The senior engineers make the final calls, the technicians ensure readings are accurate, and I coordinate between them while evaluating structural integrity in real time. Any deviation from standard procedure is immediately flagged, and yet there is always room for human judgment, the edge between what is tolerable and what could become dangerous. I start most inspections alone. The first half-mile of the main tunnel is quiet, save for the subtle vibrations of distant water and the occasional groan of settling rock. My flashlight beam traces the contours of reinforced walls. Water drips faintly from fractures that no one has deemed serious, each droplet landing in the shallow pools along the floor. The air smells faintly of damp stone and the faint chemical scent of concrete. My boots press carefully on the steel grates and worn concrete, attuned to the feedback through the soles. I note the temperature and humidity, the weight of the air, the clarity of sound as it travels down the corridor. Everything is routine, and yet in this routine, I have learned to trust my instincts. The tunnel is designed to be as predictable as possible. Curves are calculated, load-bearing points evenly distributed. The engineers who built it in the 1960s left nothing to chance, but even the most carefully built systems age. I have learned to read the signs of slow movement in concrete, the subtle warping of metal supports, the expansion and contraction of rock as water pressure changes. My instruments give me numbers, but my experience gives me context. I can tell when a wall is merely old and when it is negotiating a stress it has not handled before. Everything I do is informed by that balance. By midday, the crew has joined me for the longer sections. They know my habits. We communicate efficiently, rarely needing to raise our voices. Each inspection checkpoint is logged, measurements recorded, and minor repairs noted. No one dares to speed through this work. Speed invites mistakes, and mistakes in these tunnels can have consequences that are not immediately obvious. We move steadily, silently, aware of the weight of the structure around us, aware of the necessity to leave nothing unchecked. There's a rhythm to it, a quiet satisfaction in the repetition, in knowing that the work of decades can still be maintained through careful attention. Nothing in this first phase of inspection hinted at anything unusual. The water flow was steady, The concrete behaved as it always had, and the rock remained silent. I performed my measurements with a calm precision, moving slowly from one section to the next. It was not a place of drama or sudden danger. It was a place of diligence, patience, and observation, and for now, all was as expected. But I had learned, through years of experience, that routine can hide irregularities, and that even the smallest deviation can signal a story the tunnel has been waiting to tell. The routine of inspection had settled into its predictable rhythm. Each bolt, each pipe, each damp corner of the tunnel was accounted for, logged, and crossed off as I moved from one segment to the next. The air smelled of wet concrete, metal, and the faint, lingering oil that seeped from machinery long abandoned. My boots echoed softly on the worn catwalks, a steady counterpoint to the low hum of the distant turbines. Every shift was the same as the last, and the consistency was comforting. It was during one of these inspections, a week after the previous checks, that I noticed a slight anomaly. A section of the tunnel that had always been dry showed a thin streak of water running along the floor. Not more than a few millimeters deep, not enough to cause concern, and yet it wasn't there yesterday. I bent down to touch it, expecting a small leak from a joint or a condensation drip. My fingers met cold stone, wet only to the touch, with no obvious source. I straightened and continued, filing it away mentally as one of those quirks that came with age and wear in the tunnels. Later that morning, the anomaly repeated itself. Another stretch, previously bone dry, had the same thin trickle, and this time I noticed the sound. Soft at first, almost drowned out by my breathing and the distant hum. A faint tapping accompanied the water. Not loud, not alarming, just a delicate rhythm, barely distinguishable from a stray echo. I froze, listening. It did not continue indefinitely, only long enough for me to acknowledge its presence. Rational thought nudged me. Water drops, a stray vibration. Nothing more. By mid-afternoon, the small disturbances had multiplied. Items I had left along the catwalk, a notebook, a pair of gloves, were slightly out of place. The notebook sat a few inches closer to the wall. The gloves stacked differently than I remembered. I chalked it up to my own inattentiveness, a tired mind misremembering what I had done mere hours before. The hum of turbines, the constant drip of condensation, the low rumble of distant water, these were all things I knew well. I forced myself to move past the unease, noting locations more carefully, adjusting my pace to match a rhythm I could control. It was during a narrow section where the walls closed in and the light from my headlamp barely stretched a meter ahead that I realized the environment seemed to respond to me. As I paused to measure a steel brace, the tapping returned, 3 distinct beats against the metal grating at my feet. I looked down. Nothing moved. I bent closer, trying to pinpoint the source. The beats repeated, following the same pattern, even when I shifted a foot or moved my arm. I stopped entirely, breathing shallow. The pattern held, and then, as abruptly as it had started, it ceased. For the remainder of the day, the small irregularities persisted. Sometimes a tool would appear where I didn't leave it. Sometimes a shadow seemed to shift when I blinked, gone before I could confirm it. I began leaving tiny markers of my own, a small piece of tape on the floor, a scrap of paper beside a bolt. Each time I returned to the spot, some of these markers had moved, realigned, or were absent entirely. It was subtle, almost polite in its precision, and entirely outside of what logic or maintenance errors could explain. By evening, I had adjusted my approach. I moved slower, pausing at intervals, measuring twice before acting. I found that the anomalies became quieter, almost as if they respected the care I took. In sections where I rushed or skipped inspection, the water trickles were louder, the tapping more pronounced, and items were misaligned with greater frequency. My observations were entirely empirical. I noted patterns, recorded locations, and adjusted my movements accordingly. I had worked in these tunnels for over a decade. Experience had taught me to expect leaks, condensation, and shifting surfaces. But this was different. The tunnel, or whatever presence made itself known, seemed to be observing, responding, and remembering. There was no malice, no aggression. It was deliberate, patient, and aware. That night, back in the small crew quarters, I mentioned the day's oddities to my assistant, a junior engineer named Marcus. He laughed it off. Tunnels settle. Concrete breathes. You're imagining rhythm where none exists. I didn't argue. His logic was sound. But in the back of my mind, I knew I'd seen a pattern that could not be written off. The measures I had taken, the small adjustments to pace and attention, had altered the environment in real time. The tunnels had responded. I slept lightly, aware of the hum of distant turbines through the walls. In dreams, the tapping returned, subtle and persistent, almost conversational. My own movements in the dream seemed to trigger it, and I woke with a strange certainty that the tunnels had noted my attention and would remember it. The first anomalies, small as they were, had changed the way I moved, thought, and observed. And for the first time, I understood that routine was no longer enough to keep the environment neutral. It had become active, aware, and patient. The following days settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and subtly altered. Each inspection was meticulous, but the anomalies had grown more noticeable, their timing precise enough to warrant deliberate attention. Water trickles shifted from random streaks to consistent patterns along the walls, each small ripple marking a section of the tunnel I had already passed. When I paused to measure braces or check conduits, the patterns adjusted almost immediately, as if the tunnel was calibrating itself to my movements. I began to notice the subtle cadence in other details as well. The low hum of turbines would occasionally swell in perfect synchronization with my steps. The drip of condensation hitting metal surfaces in sequences that mirrored my own rhythm. At first, I dismissed these occurrences. Machines resonate, water flows, the mind imagines patterns. Yet over time, the alignment became unmistakable. There was a logic to it, deliberate and patient, responding to where I placed my attention, what I moved, and when I hesitated. Small markers I left behind became part of the emerging pattern. A piece of tape on the floor, a scrap of paper beside a bolt, a stray pencil I had dropped. When I returned, some were gone. Some were rearranged in a way that respected the tunnel's existing cadence. It was subtle, almost courteous, and entirely beyond any explanation I could devise. I could not say the tunnel was alive, only that it was aware, and that awareness shaped my experience in real time. I share my observations with Marcus cautiously, careful not to suggest anything supernatural. He nodded, skeptical but engaged, offering practical hypotheses, air pressure variations, mechanical resonance, minor structural shifts. I recorded his notes, but in private, I marked each anomaly more carefully, measuring the intervals between drips, noting the spacing of vibrations along the walls. It became a game of observation and adaptation. Every step, every pause, every check became a conscious negotiation with the environment. The repetition formed a pattern I could follow. Certain stretches demanded slower movement, more measured steps. Others required a pause before action, giving the subtle rhythms time to complete. I found that rushing only intensified the anomalies. The drips louder, the taps sharper, the air heavier in ways that were nearly perceptible. Respecting the sequence brought a muted equilibrium, the environment almost polite in its precision. By the end of the week, the pattern had become part of the shift itself. I moved with it naturally, anticipating slight changes in airflow, adjusting my headlamp to the smallest irregularities in reflection, noticing the almost imperceptible tilts in metal gratings. Each observation informed the next. Each adjustment maintained balance. There was no malice, no threat, only an intelligence that responded to recognition. It was a presence defined by attention rather than aggression, patient and exacting. Evenings were quiet in the quarters, but my mind remained attentive. I could replay the sequences of taps and drips with precise timing, recalling the intervals and intensity. In dreams, the patterns emerged as a dialogue, silent but unmistakable, a conversation in rhythm that followed my own subconscious motions. I awoke with a heightened awareness, a new method of observing the tunnels that was attuned to subtle signals and shifting cadences. This awareness began to inform practical decisions. When inspecting junctions, I followed not only the schematics, but also the sequence suggested by prior anomalies. It was as if the tunnel had preferences, and by honoring them, I could move through the environment with fewer disturbances, the patterns guiding my work like a quiet instruction. Each day reinforced the connection. the presence more synchronized, more deliberate, yet entirely non-threatening. I did not understand it, and I did not try to. Logic offered no explanation, and superstition had no place in my professional mindset. Still, the patterns persisted, and the necessity of attentiveness became absolute. I realized then that the tunnel did not forget. Every misstep, every moment of inattention was logged, remembered, and referenced in subtle corrections that maintained the continuity of its presence. My role had shifted from passive observer to active participant in a quiet, invisible dialogue, and every day I learned to move with patience and care. By the middle of the following week, the subtle patterns had begun to manifest in tangible ways. I first noticed it when returning from a routine inspection. A length of cable I had secured along the ceiling the day before was no longer aligned with the brackets. It hadn't fallen. It was bent slightly, looping over an adjacent support in a manner that suggested intention rather than accident. I straightened it, thought little, and moved on, but the small friction of the cable against the steel sent a soft metallic echo through the narrow passage. Later, while checking the junction between two service tunnels, I found a small wrench lying across a rail, one I was certain I had placed in a tool bin hours earlier. It was clean, untouched by dust or moisture, and perfectly balanced across the rail's lip. Nothing in the routine of the shift could have moved it, and yet there it was. I bent down, tested the rail for vibrations or air currents, found none. The wrench remained still, almost deliberate in its position. A faint chill traced my spine as I lifted it, noting the tiny scuff marks on the rail, marks that seemed to match no human step. Other signs soon followed. A jacket hung over a post where no coat hooks existed. My notebook, closed and weighted with a small stone, was open when I returned to my station. Pencils I had arranged neatly along the console had shifted by millimeters, forming a line slightly off the edges I had left them on. Even the smallest details, the direction of a paperclip, the angle of a spilled measuring tape, suggested a presence calibrating the environment around me. I found myself scanning every shadow for movement, listening for echoes that shouldn't exist, even though I understood rationally the tunnels were silent. I began leaving markers intentionally, curious whether the subtle logic would continue. A scrap of paper, a pencil, a small piece of chalk. When I returned, some were gone, some were moved. Occasionally, they would appear in positions that aligned with other features of the tunnel I hadn't yet examined, as if the presence anticipated my inspection. A small smear of wet dust on the edge of a step, a tiny stone repositioned across a threshold. These minute gestures accumulated into a clear pattern of attention. The effect was cumulative. The tunnel seemed to be learning, responding, and incorporating my own movements into its quiet architecture. It wasn't violent or intrusive. The objects were neither hidden nor broken. They merely indicated attention. The wrench balanced, the notebook opened, the cables slightly displaced. They were confirmations, acknowledgments of my presence and my pattern following. The environment had become interactive, a subtle conversation without words, entirely intelligible only to those who observed closely. Marcus began to notice, though he still sought rational explanations. Air currents, minor structural shifts, human error. He pointed to the jacket on the post, suggesting someone from another crew might have hung it. I nodded politely, keeping the wrench and notebook anomalies to myself. In the quiet corners of the tunnel, however, I had begun to understand a new layer of engagement. Each movement I made now elicited a reaction, whether through displacement, alignment, or slight auditory feedback. The effects extended to senses beyond sight. Air would become cooler when I lingered in certain sections, warmer in others, as if the tunnel itself measured the time I spent in a space. Occasionally, a faint metallic scent would rise, distinct but fleeting, often near the displaced tools or objects. The textures of walls seemed subtly different when touched after a sequence of steps, rougher or smoother, depending on the alignment of previous actions. Even the floor responded. The sound of my boots shifted slightly, the boards beneath my feet carrying the vibration and patterns I had come to associate with presence. Even sound carried new weight. Small taps echoed from beams when I leaned against them. The floorboards sometimes creaked under no weight. I had begun to speak quietly to myself, reading aloud measurements or observations, only to find that the response, the alignment of an object, the subtle movement of a tool, followed my words in near immediate feedback. The tunnel was patient, deliberate, and reactive, but not hostile. I noticed the changes in humidity as well. Certain corridors felt thicker, heavier, as though the air itself held memory of previous inspections. Moisture collected in slight rivulets along the walls after my passage, patterns that did not form naturally, but seemed to trace the path I had walked. Occasionally, a single drop of water would fall precisely onto a corner of a marker I had left, the impact almost playful in timing. I realized then that the environment had moved from passive awareness to an interactive system, a network that observed my patterns, tested responses, and confirmed presence. Every object left in place, every misalignment corrected by unseen hands, every air shift or faint metallic scent was part of continuum. I could no longer work in the tunnels as I had initially. Each step, each check required mindfulness. The cost of inattentiveness was minor but unmistakable. A misaligned wrench, a tipped pencil, a slight disruption of the cadence I had come to follow. Sleep brought reflections. In dreams, I observed objects shifting in impossible sequences, tools arranging themselves in alignment with rhythms I could not consciously recall. Upon waking, I checked the stations and found some of the dream movements realized in reality. It was a form of proof, a confirmation that my observations mattered. The tunnel did not merely remember. It adapted and responded, a patient, unspoken interlocutor shaping the environment in subtle, material ways. From the moment I accepted that the tunnel was aware, my work shifted. Each descent required deliberation. Each inspection became a negotiation. The first clear interaction came one morning when I returned to a service branch I had mapped days earlier. The route seemed identical to the last check, yet as I stepped forward, the floor subtly shifted under my weight. Not a collapse, not an instability I could measure, but a cadence in the boards, the vibration timed exactly with my steps. I paused. Footfall after footfall echoed differently depending on the line I chose. The environment was guiding me, testing attention, and I began to adjust instinctively. I left markers, small scraps of chalk and paper, yet their positions changed each time I returned. Sometimes a pencil would tilt toward a wall, sometimes lie flat, aligned perfectly with the edge of a support beam. The corridor's air would thicken when I hesitated or shift imperceptibly to encourage movement forward. I learned to walk slowly, deliberately, leaving deliberate pauses and listening to the subtle changes around me. Each action seemed to solicit a response, often minutes later, but always precise. Marcus remained rational but curious. He laughed quietly when I described objects moving on their own, insisting it was the settling of an old structure, vibrations from distant machinery, drafts that carried small debris. I could not disprove it, yet my own observations defied those explanations. A jacket that had hung over a post now appeared draped differently after I lingered. A wrench that I had returned to its bin would later rest on a ledge, oriented along lines I had walked. The tunnel's pattern was patient, meticulous, and adaptive. The psychological pressure was subtle. I felt the weight of observation without a gaze. Decisions took longer. I recalibrated instinctively. If I moved too quickly, the environment responded with minor misalignments, a shift in a tool, a sound echoing at an angle I did not expect. If I slowed, I felt a gentle encouragement, almost imperceptible, guiding me along paths that felt safer, even when maps suggested otherwise. Other senses began to register more clearly. Air became damp in unexpected corners, carrying faint metallic smells. Floorboards responded differently beneath my feet, subtle vibrations indicating alignment or misalignment with prior steps. Even light behaved strangely. My helmet lamp occasionally reflected at angles that suggested depth or continuity that was not truly there. The tunnel's awareness was patient, and it measured everything, adapting slowly to my presence, as though I were a participant in a quiet, continuous dialogue. In those weeks, the pattern became predictable enough to allow work, but unpredictable enough to command attention. Tools were replaced subtly. Markers shifted, and the very air seemed aware of hesitation or confidence. I stopped rushing inspections. Every lift of a wrench, every note in my book, every turn in the corridor was performed with intent. The presence did not need violence. It needed recognition, and my recognition of its attention reinforced the pattern. Even communication with Marcus and the others shifted. I began leaving notes rather than speaking aloud, subtle signals of presence and alignment. A nod, a small adjustment of a tool, a repositioning of a mark. All were sufficient acknowledgement. The tunnel responded consistently to human patterns. My coworkers were included only in the ways they observed, not in ways they could control. Sleep continued to reflect this coexistence. Dreams mirrored the corridors, objects moving with patient precision, shadows shifting without threat, air thickening in ways I felt more than saw. Upon waking, I found small confirmations, a marker slightly repositioned, a pencil aligned with a beam, a subtle shift in dust that traced my prior steps. It was no longer imagination, it was interaction. The tunnel demanded attention, patience, and respect, and I complied. The first month of this coexistence was exhausting. My steps were deliberate, my mind constantly scanning, my senses tuned to subtle cues. Yet a rhythm emerged, a dialogue without words. A communication of awareness through objects, air, and touch. I could no longer ignore the environment, and yet I understood that acknowledgement, rather than avoidance, ensured stability. The tunnel had become a living system, one that responded to my discipline as surely as I responded to its cues. It was not fear that drove me, but recognition. Each misaligned object, each shift in air or vibration, each faint scent carried information. The environment remembered and responded. I had become part of its continuity, a participant in the measured, patient intelligence of the tunnel itself. The last day of inspection arrived quietly, without warning or event. I moved through the tunnel one final time, every step deliberate, every marker accounted for. The corridors had memorized my presence. Their subtle responses were familiar. Air shifted slightly as I passed. Dust settled differently on surfaces I had walked countless times, and faint vibrations echoed in a rhythm I had learned to follow. I reached the final junction, where the old service ladder rose to the surface. The light above felt impossibly distant, yet real, offering the simple promise of normalcy. My helmet lamp cut a narrow path ahead, but I knew it was no longer necessary. I could feel the alignment of the space, the responsiveness of the walls, the subtle cues that had guided every descent. The tunnel watched until the very end, patient and precise. I paused at the ladder, resting a hand on the cold metal, and considered the passage I had traversed. Every misaligned tool, every repositioned marker, every subtle draft and vibration had been accounted for in ways that could not be measured by any logbook or safety report. There was no closure here, no understanding, only acknowledgement, silent, continuous, and enduring. As I climbed, the ladder felt uncommonly solid beneath my hands. The air changed with each rung, warmer and freer, carrying scents of rain and earth from the surface. I emerged into daylight, into the empty yard, and exhaled a long breath I had not realized I was holding. The mind behind me remained dark, patient, and intact. On the surface, nothing had changed, yet everything had shifted in ways invisible to those who had not been there. The company, the logs, the protocols, none of it accounted for what had transpired. The subtle awareness, the precise responsiveness, the quiet insistence of presence, all remained beneath the earth. I walked away, carrying only the memory, the rhythm of movement, and the knowledge that the tunnel's attention did not end with my departure. Weeks passed. Work continued. Inspections and maintenance became routine once more. Yet I could not shake the sense that the environment was aware of my absence. Small signs appeared. A shifted marker where none had been placed. Dust settled along a line I had memorized. Air thickened momentarily in hallways long unused. The awareness persisted, patient, precise, and unyielding, indifferent to human schedules. Even at home, I felt the echo of it. My dreams traced corridors I had left behind. Objects moved with quiet precision, and faint shifts in air and vibration followed me in sleep. The mind had not ended its observation. It had extended it, a constant presence that demanded acknowledgement without requiring understanding. I realized, finally, that there was no separation. I had left the physical space, yet the awareness remained, coexisting silently with my memory. It was not threatening, not deliberate in harm, but present, measuring, responding, patient. The rhythm, the subtle alignment, the quiet insistence. These follow me beyond the walls, beyond the earth, and into every moment where I remember to be attentive. And so I move forward in my life, the mind behind me, yet never fully gone. The knowledge that attention can exist without violence, that presence can be patient and precise, remains. I learned to carry it as part of my routine, as part of how I see space and movement, understanding that acknowledgement itself can be a form of coexistence. Even now, years later, the memory remains. Footsteps echo differently when I walk long corridors. Dust seems to settle along invisible lines. A faint vibration beneath my desk reminds me of the patient intelligence below. The tunnel is never defeated, only acknowledged. Its presence, quiet and persistent, endures beyond every exit, and I am compelled to remember.